Good morning, church. If you would turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 26, we're going to center our thoughts around the words that are found in chapter 26 and verse 18. When I was a boy, there was a song that hit the radio entitled, "Grandpa, Tell Me About the Good Old Days." And it went like this: "Grandpa, tell me about the good old days. Sometimes it feels like that this world has gone crazy. Grandpa, take me back to yesterday, when the lines between right and wrong didn't seem so easy. Did lovers really fall in love to stay and stand beside each other come what may? Was a promise really something that people kept? Not just something they would say and then forget? Did families really bow their heads to pray? And did daddies really never go away? Oh, Grandpa, tell me about the good old days." That song is rooted in something we call nostalgia. Now, we all have nostalgia about something. There is some event or some period of our lives, some person, some relationship in the past that we look back upon, and it seems that year after year after year, our fondness for that continues to build. Isn't that right? And that's what nostalgia is. It is an intense fondness, an intensely positive spirit about things that happened in the past. And we might say, well, how can that be a bad thing? Well, in many ways it isn't. Those words we just quoted from that old song, those are words of positive nostalgia about a time when we feel good about things, when things are better than they seem to be now. And that's the difficulty of nostalgia, is sometimes it colors the present based upon events or facts of the past that have been in some ways built up in our mind and emotions. And the reason I wanted to introduce this verse today in this way is in some ways this verse centers around the idea of going back to the way we used to be, or going back to the way that our fathers, our forefathers did things. And that can seem like a very good thing. And indeed, in this text, it's going to be. However, it's important that we find the balance, that we counterposition the good things about nostalgia, and remember that we also have to look at it with wisdom so that we don't just get into this trap of infusing events with the past with so much positive emotion that we forget the reality of what took place then. Now, the reason this is important is, and what I'm really trying to get at, is we have to pick and choose the good parts of yesterday rather than in our mind building it up that all was good. And this is vitally essential today in the church, because many of us look back to a time. We've talked about that in our closing lesson on the minor prophets last Sunday about Haggai and how they were rebuilding the temple and they couldn't really get to work because the older folks among them looked back and they remembered Solomon's temple when they were little, and they said, oh, this will never be what that one was. And that nostalgia, now they were right in that Solomon's temple was a gloriously beautiful, magnificent structure. But they were wrong in thinking we just need to be exactly like we were back then. Because it was a magnificent structure who was being housed by wicked people who weren't worshiping God in it, but rather had even gone to the point of worshiping the pagan idols and gods of their time. You see, that nostalgia was right on one hand, but on another hand, they failed to see the details, the big picture. Well, this passage today tells us that we need to at times go back and remember the way our fathers have done things. Because it reads in chapter 26, verse 18, "And Isaac dug again the wells of his father, which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And he called them by the names which his father had also called him." So he goes and he redigs his father's old wells. And I want you to understand that I think it is appropriate and it is time that in the Lord's church today we redig some of our father's old wells. You understand? That we go back to the same place, not physically, but in a spiritual sense, and we tap in again to some of the good things of yesterday. But I want to make sure that we're not just simply making this a road down the path to great nostalgia. Because not everything that we look back to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago in the church wasn't perfect 60 years ago. And it's important that we differentiate what the good wells were. Just like with him, he's going to look back to his father Abraham. Well, he needs to tap in again to the faith of Father Abraham. Amen? Amen. He needs to tap in again to the integrity of Father Abraham and the willingness to follow God no matter what, and even sacrifice his own son. But he doesn't need to tap in to the faithlessness of Abraham, who would lie because he was afraid. And he doesn't need to tap in any way to Abraham's inability to truly trust God at times when he needed to. Therefore, he would start his own family with Ishmael and run ahead of God. So there are parts of who his father was as he redigs. Now we know this is physical wells, but there's an application. Why would he go back to the wells of his father and redig in exactly the same spot? We need to do the same thing, but still be realistic. You know, the church of 60 years ago, there are some wonderful things. So we're going to talk about those in a minute. But let's get the parts we don't want to address and to repeat out in the open, okay? There were things like a sense of God that was inaccurate in regard to his character. If you go back in the church 60 years with all the good, you're also going to see a very legalistic perspective about God and man. We don't need to redig that old well. If you go back 60 years in the church, you're going to see a sense of harshness where individual Christians would deal with one another, especially as they would deal with outsiders. Hence, in many parts of this nation, we deal with that still as we try to reach out. Oh, Church of Christ, I know what you people are like. Because they had someone who was a neighbor or a member of the church who treated them in a very callous, hard, condemning kind of way that hurt the gospel for 60 years. We don't need to redig that well. 60 years ago in the church, racism was rampant. Rampant. We don't need to redig that well. So, as we look back and examine yesterday, we have to see it through clear eyes and determine what are the wells of my fathers that I need to dig again, and what are the ones I need to leave filled and leave in the past. Well, today we're going to talk about, now that we've gotten that out of the way, what are the wells of our fathers that we should address once more and resurrect within the body of Christ? And I have just a few suggestions. Number one is the well of personal integrity. I remember my grandfather, and James Williams, he didn't ever have very much. He died with $200 in his bank account. He owned his house and they sold it for $17,000. That's all he had in the world. But he never owed anybody, because my grandpa would never borrow anything he couldn't pay back. And he told us, I remember being a little boy and we'd go fishing at at Lake Mermet right there in southern Illinois, and we'd fish and just have the best times. And he used those times to impart grandfatherly wisdom. And I remember him saying things like, son, you know, we don't have all that much, but we have something more important than money. We have a name. And he said, your name is the most valuable thing you have, and you can ruin it in just a minute. So cherish that name. Be honest. Have integrity. And I know that was the case because later on when I was in high school, and then right after high school I graduated, moved back there, worked for the summer with my uncle. I was driving down a dirt road in my car at 19 years old, doing what 19-year-olds do on dirt roads in their car. I don't even know what the needle was at, but it was probably past the numbers, you know. Just flying along with the radio blasting, speakers, boom, 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 shaking the car until I see lights in my rearview mirror. And I pull over and I had out-of-state plates. I was in Illinois with Washington state plates. I mean, that's just like the other side of the universe, right? And sure enough, this big county sheriff deputy steps out of his car, and I mean, he's right out of a television show. I mean, his name was probably Bubba. I don't know. Okay, he walks up to my window, and the look on his face was, I thought I might die. And I rolled down my window. You know, we still rolled them down back then. And he says, boy, that's what he called me, boy. Boy, we don't drive that way around here. I don't know how you drive in Washington, where you come from, but we don't drive that way around here. Give me your license and registration. I pull it out. I mean, he is hot. I hand it to him. Yes, sir. He takes it and he says, Williams. You kin to some of the Williams around here? I said, yes, sir. Lifeline, you know. Yes, sir. I'm staying with my Uncle Wayman. He said, that makes your granddaddy James Williams. He said, whose son are you? I said, I'm Stan Williams, Grandpa's youngest. He said, oh, he's the preacher that moved off. Oh, yeah, okay. He says, well, son, now you slow her down. Have a nice day, but you need to be safer now. You slow her down and you tell your granddaddy, I said hello. I didn't remember his name. But I told my granddad later that afternoon, I said, Granddad, you're not going to believe what happened here. Well, what's intriguing is that man, that officer, respected the integrity of my family. And I didn't have much integrity in that moment, but it was bestowed because of that. You know, I want to have the kind of integrity that my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather had, that had that kind of impact on somebody in the community. I want to re-dig that well and dig it deep and dig it strong. Integrity. Being a people whose yes is their yes, whose no is their no. We can't fall into today's philosophy that, you know, if it works, you can compromise your integrity. I heard about a fellow who was going to figure out what to do with his horse, and he asked his local vet for advice. He said, I got this horse, and some days he limps, and some days he walks just fine. You got any advice? What do you think I should do? The doctor said, well, next time he's walking fine, sell him. Well, you see, that might be the advice that the world would give. But a person of integrity doesn't do that, do they? When you think about this story, there was a coach, Coach Stroud, had been the coach of the Bulldogs of Rockland County High School in Conyers, Georgia. And they'd never been all that great of a basketball team. But then a few years ago, they barely made it into the playoffs, 21 wins, 5 losses. And they continued to just barely squeak by game after game. And then in the final championship game of the state of Georgia, they came back from being way behind and with a buzzer beater at the last second won the state championship. But today at Rockdale High School, there's no trophy in the trophy case. Because about a week and a half after they won the state championship, going back over the season's records, they found out that they had played in their very first playoff game a player that was academically ineligible for 45 seconds. 45 seconds. And in that 45 seconds, he never made a basket, he didn't steal a basketball, and he didn't make a rebound. He was completely and utterly not a factor. But today they don't have a trophy because they turned themselves in. And the Coach Stroud was asked, why? And people were upset. And he said, championships, they're remembered, but I would rather us be remembered for our character. He said, and I'm here to teach boys basketball, but I'm here to teach boys how to be men, more importantly. People of integrity. That's what we're called to be by the Lord. And that's one thing that our fathers, many of them, they understood. That's a well that should be redug. In Daniel chapter 6, Daniel 6 verses 1 through 5, you remember this story where Darius, it'll come after the reading from this morning, when Nebuchadnezzar's nation was overcome by the Persians and Darius becomes in charge of Babylon. And it says, Darius set over the kingdom 120 satraps over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. And then look at verse 3. But then Daniel distinguished himself above all the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Now I love this phrasing here in the text. Because an excellent spirit was in him. My grandfather never had any money, but he had an excellent spirit. In fact, I loved going to his house because the biggest treat was my new pocket knife. Every time I went. My grandpa had more pocket knives than the Swiss Army Company. Because he owned a junkyard. And for years and years and years, whenever anybody in that community, maybe that's why deputy sheriffs loved him. Maybe they needed an alternator or needed a starter. And if you came into Williams' junkyard and you needed a part and you didn't have enough money, there was a barter system. Where my granddad would say, well, if you can't afford it, he said, well, you got anything you'd like to trade? And it didn't matter what they said. It was always a reasonable trade to my grandpa. There were times people needed an engine, and all they had was a pocket knife. And I'd go in and open the drawer, and he'd say, yeah, pick you one. And there's all these pocket knives. Because he was an honest man who tried to do good to others in integrity. And there was an excellent spirit. And I want to redig that well. We need to redig that well. The well of personal integrity. The second one that we would note is, in times gone by, our fathers, they drank deeply from the well of kindness to one's neighbors. As I mentioned, my grandpa did that for folks. Well, when my grandfather died, I preached part of his funeral. My dad and I did it together. I was a young preacher of just my mid-20s at the time, but couldn't fit everybody in that small town in the funeral. And the viewing, that's a bigger deal in the South than even the funeral. The viewing stretched around the block and around the corner. And everybody who came by, I loved your granddaddy. He was always so good to everybody he knew. You see, we need to redig the well of kindness and goodness, of being neighbors again. Of being kind of people can be counted on. There was a sweet little lady named Mamie who had to go to the post office to get her mail. And she would always get her post office box and check the box. And then she'd go up and get 1 or 2 stamps from the counter year after year after year. And the ladies who worked at the post office loved her. But then, close to Christmas time one year, the lines were exceedingly long. And sweet little Mamie, she sat in that line, stood there for long, long minutes. Till finally, the lady in front of her turned around and said, "Ma'am, are you just needing stamps? You know, there's a stamp machine in the lobby." And Mamie's response was, "Yes, I know. But the stamp machine won't ask me about my arthritis." And you see, what she needed was that kindness and that personal touch, that interest in her life. And there was a time where our fathers and our forefathers, they valued being kind to other people. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "Let your gentleness be known among all men, for the Lord is at hand." I want to redig the well of my fathers. I want us as a church to redig the wells of our forefathers, to find again not only a personal integrity, but a kindness to other people, so that we're never defined, so that 60 years from today, when someone says, "Hey, will you come to church with me? Where do you go?" "I go to the Church of Christ." No one ever again thinks, "I'm not going there because those people are harsh, judgmental, and mean." God forbid. We need to redig the well of personal kindness. And thirdly, we need to redig the well of conviction, of the ability to commit to things. That text that was read for us from Daniel 3 of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can be summed up in verse 17, where it says, "This is the case, the God who we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image." Here's a conviction, and you got to understand, these are young men. They're slaves carried off to Babylon from Israel. And here they have the courage to stand up against the rage of Nebuchadnezzar, the mightiest man that had ever walked the earth at that time, and say to him, "Our Lord can save us from this fire, but even if He doesn't, we will never serve you." Never. In this text we see truly magnificent valor, incredible courage, born of a heart filled with conviction, an absolute conviction. We have had fathers and forefathers of conviction. In my own personal life, I could tell you story after story, and I have, of my daddy's conviction, standing up even to wrongs within the church. I think of my grandpa's conviction. Smoked 2 packs a day all of his life, until my dad got sick with pneumonia, and the doctor said, "Well, we don't know if your little boy will live through the night." So my grandpa went out to the woodshed and prayed in tears, "Lord, if you save my boy, I'll never pick him up again." And from that day, my daddy, of course, got better. I'm here. And my grandpa never bought another pack. Because it was a generation that understood conviction, that understood being able to make a decision and stick by it. There was a aged woman in the time between the Testaments. Between Malachi and the start of Matthew was the period of the Greek conquest of the world. And in the area of Jerusalem, there was a group called the Seleucids, one of the 4 branches of the Greek Empire that ruled there. And the worst of all the Seleucid rulers was King Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes hated Judaism. And he decided that during his reign he was going to stamp out this primitive, backward religion of these Jews that he ruled. To do so, he punished them for worshiping God. This is what you can read in the books that are set, the Apocrypha that's set in between the Old and New Testament, particularly of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And as he is doing so, he persecuted, and his main form of killing people is he burned them in oil. He sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, in the temple, just as a smack in the face of the Jews and their God. And one story of legend talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, who brought an aged woman with her 6 boys before him. And he told her, "You will deny that God of the Jews, and you will worship the pantheon of gods of the Greeks, or I'll boil your sons alive right in front of you." She would not, and he boiled her first son alive. In tears, she still would not, and her second son she saw die. The same thing repeated until finally her baby, the youngest of her sons, was all that was left. And in utter frustration, Antiochus Epiphanes screamed at her and offered her. He said, "I don't understand. What is wrong with you backward people? I will give you half of my kingdom, anything you want in the world. Just deny this God of the Jews. Don't see your last son be killed." To which this faithful, aged Jewish woman turned to her son, embraced him, and in tears, with broken words, she said, "I love you, my son. I will see you soon. Die well." Conviction. And conviction is a well that has been completely filled in our culture. People aren't convicted of things anymore. Conviction means that you cannot be moved, that you cannot be shaken. And we need to redig that well, and we need to redig it deep. Because if there's anything this world needs from God's people in a time of moral and philosophical chaos, it's a people strong in their convictions. Well, there are things from the past that we need not allow nostalgia to color, where we think that, well, you know, everything, we just need it to be like it used to be in every way. No, that's not how believers who want the things of God look at the past. How we look at the past is through lenses of honesty, where we say there were things we need to leave in the past. But indeed, there are some wells of our fathers that need to be redug. The well of personal integrity. The well of kindness to others. And dig deep again the well of conviction. If any of you this morning, if you look at your life and you say, I need to redig some wells. Perhaps it has to do with that personal integrity. Are you honest? Is that the first thing people, as you deal with them at work or in your family, are they going to say, that man, that woman, that person is honest, has true integrity? What about kindness? I believe that God's people should be the kindest people in all the world, don't you? Gentle, loving, never mean-spirited. Do you need to work on redigging and filling in the deep well of anger and rage and lack of self-control? If you do, dig the well again of kindness and then throw all that dirt in those negative wells and fill them in. And what about the well of conviction? Do you have that absolute, I am yours no matter what, tenacity? If not, you need to redig that well. If we can help you this morning in any way, we've got a shovel for you. If you'll come right now as we stand and as we sing.